Welcome here from the ISPOR in Montreal. It's the ISPOR for the US markets, and it's May 16th here in Montreal, live from the booth from Wickenstones, which is your partners in building value. So with me today is Dr. Stefan Walzer. He's from MArS, Market Access and Pricing Strategy, a consulting company from Germany serving market access and pricing for the DACH regions. And with me also today is Annie Loos from Wickenstones. She's a global HTA expert. Nice to have you here, Annie. And also with me is the CEO and founder of Wickenstone, Eddie Gibson. Nice to have you here, Eddie.
Thank you.
So, we all want to talk today about who we are. So, actually, what is Wickenstone doing?
Yeah, so Wickenstones is a global strategic market access consultancy. We help people think about building their evidence, communicating with stakeholders, and really giving themselves the best chance in the world of achieving market access.
Wonderful. And our topic for today is the earthquake. Donald Trump actually, like through the whole pharma market here, everybody was like sending emails on Monday morning out. So I actually got 3 messages of like, hey, have you read that? So we want to talk about today about the executive order of Donald Trump. So Annie, what's that executive order actually about?
Yeah, so it's really about demanding that manufacturers lower their prices that are aligned with the most favored nation prices, which is essentially the lowest prices that are available ex-US. It's really more of a demand from the executive branch about making sure that ex-US countries are no longer free riding from American prices and taking advantage of the higher prices that we have here that we pay for pharmaceuticals.
Are there any actual actions or fears that the pharma companies now have?
Well, I think one of
For
the
us?
main questions is it's really unclear how it applies to the private industry, just given that the federal government has more leeway to negotiate prices on the federal level with CMS, for example, versus the private market. And actually would be counterproductive to kind of his platform around deregulation. So that's one big thing that's really unclear.
Okay, great. So when we think about that executive order, I mean, we know Donald Trump, you know, he makes that out. He want to like change a lot of things suddenly. So what are the chances that they're like that this will be like taking place soon, like a huge change?
Well, it's intended to be immediate, but it's really the timeline's really unclear. From my perspective, it's really more about moving the needle, just given that it's such a bipartisan issue here in the States. But there's really unclear consequences as a result of this if manufacturers don't follow suit. However, this is aligned with some of the other initiatives that the U.S. has been pushing, specifically starting with the ACA and ISPOR, and now with the IRA, just kind of moving the needle a little bit to push for more reasonable drug prices here in the U.S.
Okay, so now consequences like for startup companies, for biotech. So could be there a scenario if I know a biotech, I just launch in the US and ignore the rest of the world. So could that be something?
Thanks, Liz. I think there's several answers to that question. So the first is this executive order has created uncertainty and change in the market, and the best strategy in the face of uncertainty isn't to undo things and to retrench to a single position, but rather to think about how can I prepare for any eventuality. So as a starting point, even if the outcome is not to launch in certain markets, biotech companies, pharma companies should now be thinking about how do I shape my evidence package to be ready to be challenged in lots of different ways. How is the US market going to learn from those other markets and learn from the way that evidence is assessed? So should I be ready for the UK, for Germany, for France, to make sure that if those tools are used in the US at some point, I have those tools at my fingertips? Also, if the US market changes structurally, how do I make the most of those European markets to continue to gain good returns? It's not clear that the best strategy is to retrench just into the US and say, look, let's ignore the rest of the world, nor is the best strategy to say, let's retrench into the rest of the world and ignore the US. Those are a little bit
work, right?
Yeah, they both won't work. We have to play the cards which we have in front of us.
Great idea. So, Stefan, what are you thinking about that one?
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree what I have just heard as well, especially let's say from Eddie, right? I think what I want maybe as well to stress a bit more is we had very similar kind of discussions maybe 15 years ago in Germany, where everybody was basically as well complaining in Germany prices are too high, especially in comparison to our neighbor countries. So that was a key thing, and it was a big discussion. I think there was some we don't work via orders, but a lot of political kind of wannabe directions. And finally, we got, as we all know, the AMNOG, right? But I think at the end of the day, because you all were also asking about the timing, when we could have really seen it, the bigger kind of impact was not immediately. I mean, those markets are, let's say, slowly changing as well, especially when it comes to maybe new kind of products, right? I think that's as well something keeping in mind. We have now AMNOG since roughly 13 years. And of course, at least generally, when we see the analysis, you see an impact from a pricing perspective, meaning prices were at least going a bit more in the directions of other countries. It's now more the kind of question, and we have as well seen a bit of evidence from different as well academic institutions in the US. What if you include even something like international reference pricing? Prices are normally not even going really down. They are rather getting to each other, but more on a higher level. So that will be for me as well a key question in which direction that would really go. On top of course, what do you really want to do? Is it only the US? Where I think it's maybe a bit of a question in general, or do you just take into consideration what you have as well learned in the other markets? That's very similar, again, just very quickly to the German example. I mean, Germany before, you could have launched with any kind of evidence. Nowadays, you first check which kind of evidence do you need, and then you do the kind of launch sequencing. And of course, we also have cases where companies do not launch, or maybe at least launch later in Germany. Rarely, but it happens. And that's also what maybe you could see as a potential kind of role model in the US.
Great. So, Annie, what are you thinking about that strategy?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear the Germany perspective as well, because I think we're leaning in a similar direction. It's just taking a little bit longer. I think the intention of the EO was really to, again, push that needle a little bit further into that area of more price controls is better. And we need to make sure that our drug pricing is tied to something, even though the executive order doesn't necessarily stipulate certain evidence requirements are needed to kind of demonstrate your value. But it's definitely leaning in that direction, especially like I mentioned earlier with the IRA, with ISPOR. We're not quite there yet, and it's going to take a little bit longer, I think, but it's definitely moving in a similar direction.
Great. So, what would be the consequences in long term? What do you think can happen there with starting now, working on prices on the US market on that initiative of Donald J. Trump?
Thanks. I think there's two strands to the executive order. One is a focus on manufacturer pricing, and the other is a focus on the structure of the market and the levels of people who make money within the market. So fundamentally and fairly quickly, we might expect to see some changes in the way that the market is structured in the US, which won't change the price for the manufacturer, but it will change the stakeholders who are involved. It will change the way that you have to present data, the way that you interact with different stakeholders, and actually some of the functions that a manufacturer will have to perform in order to supply the market. So there's probably some really fundamental organizational structures that need to happen fairly quickly. I think as Annie and Stefan have said, moving the pricing of not an individual product, but the market as a whole takes quite a long time, and it's more a slow process of evolution towards a price goal rather than a step change in price. Some of the tools which have been bubbling away in the background with ISA in the States and some of the suggestions coming through from CMS, etc., are already starting to look at how can the US better define value in the products that they're looking at. And this executive order just brings some of those into focus. And it's likely that some of those tools are going to be more and more important as we move forward, with pricing, yes, starting to come down a little, maybe in the US.
The first wave, right? So
in the first wave, but unlikely that we will see those prices fall off a cliff and come down to some of the international levels that we see.
So the lemmings, there's no lemming dying. So everybody drags like jumping over the cliff.
Yeah, the first one to jump over the cliff takes everyone else over the cliff. Yeah. But I don't foresee that happening here.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that good statement. Stefan?
Yeah, maybe just to add to what you had just said, I think the important thing for me is as well the little word evidence, right? And the evidence requirements. I think if you take into consideration how to define value best, which is or should at least be the main driver for pricing, if it is actually really is, it's another question, right? But should be, it's probably as well a good opportunity to really have a look on the European markets. I think in Europe, if you take UK NICE, if you take Germany, France, a lot of other, let's say, institutions, or the European JCA now, I think has already set quite high standards. And I think that's maybe as well something to look for, where again, I think you can see that as well as a role model from Germany, where nothing was seen before. And suddenly everybody was starting to take into considerations, plan it appropriately. And that could maybe as well be something what we see even further. The US is and was and is again and still probably the most important market just because of the size of it, right? And so that will still hold true, I think. But I think important is probably as well that the US might just be seen as well part of that reference pricing, generally the launch sequence planning, right? Where before it was rather US with its price because it's a different market, and then you have, if you want to go to Europe when thinking about internationalization, then you have had as well the kind of launch sequence planning. So that was, I think, before. Now I think for the future, I think you would need to, of course, plan what else will happen across the world. How would you make sure that the price in the US can be sustained from an industry perspective? So that will be a key driver, including obviously the kind of evidence requirement.
I think, of course, we're very European focused because some of us are from Europe. But we're standing here in Canada. So Canada is a very thin borderline away from the US and already uses a lot of those tools of HTA, which have been used very successfully by other nations around the world.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think the other important thing is probably as well why maybe also having a look on Europe or other systems, because you're totally right. We're speaking as well about Canada, we're just here, but also Australia, New Zealand have implemented those HTA systems, right? But I think the important thing is also when thinking, just coming back to your first question, Lutz, what if I just go to the US? Is maybe a way, but in case you would suddenly have a competitor launching and they might have not done their job right, let's say, right? As they have maybe first gone to Europe with maybe even lower price, that could even bring the whole pricing of that asset as well down, because it might be then directly linked from reference into a reference perspective, let's say, as well to your own product. Hence, you would still need to know what to do ideally in Europe, even if you would decide not to launch. That's, I think, as well an important consideration. And if you then really decide not to launch, is another question mark, which ultimately you can drive that as well and maybe set as well the hurdles higher for competition.
Yeah. But Stefan, listening to you, so that's also impacts like the whole launching sequence, right? So I mean, of course, it's a no-brainer. Something will happen with the launching sequence, but then the deeper look in there is like launching will be much more complicated, right? Because if I take your words, think about that, then I just say about the appropriate comparator therapy. This could be probably a lemming that just go first over the cliff and takes you down the water.
I mean, I don't know whether it's getting more complicated or complex, because I think ultimately we have that already generally from a global perspective that you do these launch sequence planning, right? Now you just add another country, but I think the complexity is more to what we said a bit earlier in terms of evidence planning, right? It sounds so simple, right? What do we need? Maybe with the endpoints, I could maybe rather see that it's a bit easier because you can find always somewhere some endpoints what payers across the globe accept. But the key thing is what you have just said. What about the comparator? And the comparator could be different across the different countries. And you cannot run 3, 4, 5, 10 different studies against different comparators. And that is maybe where the tricky part starts, right? So you might have the right study, maybe for the US, maybe for one or the other country, but maybe not for the fourth or fifth country. And then you're going back again to what will then happen with that price there. And do you want to launch, let's say, quite close to the US and those other markets where maybe that first study would maybe fit?
I think one of the challenges here is that all of the tools to make these decisions already exist. They're already out there in the industry. But the industry generally is organizationally not equipped to make those decisions, including the US. So if you look at larger pharmaceutical companies, very often the US will have a lot of power. They'll make decisions independently of the ex-US world. And that starts to get eroded now. The US is looking outwards in terms of pricing, it's looking outwards in terms of tools. So the US organizations and US based biotech need to start to think about how does the US market play with the rest of the world. And that's something which is new and a little bit different in the decision making process.
And definitely very different from the way we've traditionally thought about just gaining regulatory approval and that being the primary access route here in the US. We need to think now more broadly and take in lessons learned from Germany, from Australia, and really apply those here to be more proactive in our evidence planning so that we're more prepared here in the US for those more restrictive potentially evidence requirements or more restrictive evidence requirements depending on what the comparator should be and aligning that with a more European or global perspective.
Oh, thanks. Any last comments? I think that was just wonderful words for the end. You just have to prepare, or you just have to be more prepared when you're launching now. And actually, we have partners here to help you with the preparation. So you go with and go on www.wickenstones.com. Here, your partners in building value and global strategy planning consultancy based in London and in the US, and they're gonna help you to build your value. So, and also check out our website from MArS. It's www.marketaccess4-0.com for consulting for Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and NICE Market Access 4.0 AI Secure Solutions. Well, thank you all. This was live from Montreal. Give a warm applause to Dr. Stefan Walzer, the CEO and founder of MArS.
Thank you.
Also, we have Annie Loos from Wickenstones here. And also Eddie Gibson here from London, the CEO and founder of Wickenstones. Great to have you all here.